June 4th, 1942. The waters north of Midway Atoll. At 10:22 in the morning, 37 American dive bombers roll over into their attack dives, and within 6 minutes, 3 Japanese aircraft carriers that dominated the Pacific just moments earlier are burning wrecks destined for the ocean floor. The pilots flying those dive bombers are not flying the Pacific War's most celebrated aircraft. The SBD Dauntless is slow, lightly armed, and lacks the range and speed of the fighters and torpedo planes that share the carrier decks alongside it. Even its own name carries an unassuming quality compared to the more aggressive-sounding aircraft designations favored elsewhere in American naval aviation. And pilots assigned to dive bomber squadrons throughout 1941 and early 1942 have grown accustomed to a certain quiet resignation about flying an aircraft that rarely draws the same attention or glamour as the fighter jockeys and torpedo crews sharing their carrier decks. Japanese naval aviators, veterans of Pearl Harbor and a string of stunning victories across the Pacific and Indian Oceans, have spent 6 months treating American carrier aircraft with something bordering on contempt, confident that nothing in the United States Navy's arsenal can match the skill of Japan's carrier pilots or the quality of Japan's aircraft. This confidence is not without foundation. Japanese carrier aviators have, by the spring of 1942, compiled an extraordinary combat record, sweeping aside British, Dutch, and American naval forces across an arc stretching from Pearl Harbor to Ceylon, sinking battleships, cruisers, and carriers with a precision and aggressiveness that has left Allied naval planners struggling simply to slow the pace of Japan's advance, let alone reverse it. What happens in the 6 minutes beginning at 10:22 that morning will shatter that confidence permanently, and it will do so using an aircraft nobody on either side of the Pacific expected to decide the outcome of the entire war. To understand why this single morning carries such staggering weight, you have to understand the position Imperial Japan occupies in the spring of 1942. Since the attack on Pearl Harbor the previous December, Japanese forces have swept across the Pacific and Southeast Asia with a speed and success that has stunned military planners on both sides of the conflict, seizing the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies while inflicting catastrophic losses on Allied naval forces at every turn. The scale and speed of this expansion has convinced many in the Japanese Naval High Command that the fundamental balance of power in the Pacific has shifted permanently in Japan's favor, an assessment reinforced by the humiliating string of Allied defeats that has left American, British, and Dutch naval forces scattered, outmatched, and largely incapable of mounting any serious challenge to Japan's continued expansion across the region. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of Japan's combined fleet, understands that this string of victories cannot continue indefinitely against the industrial might of the United States, and he has staked his strategic vision for the entire war on a single, decisive operation, luring the remaining American aircraft carriers into a trap at Midway Atoll, a tiny but strategically vital American outpost roughly 1,300 miles northwest of Hawaii, and destroying them in one overwhelming battle before American shipyards can replace their losses. Yamamoto, who spent years studying in the United States and understands better than most of his fellow Japanese officers the sheer scale of American industrial capacity, recognizes that Japan's window for a decisive war-shaping victory is narrow and closing, a strategic urgency that shapes the entire Midway operation's ambitious, almost overreaching scope. Yamamoto's plan hinges on Japan's combined fleet possessing every advantage that has made it nearly unstoppable since Pearl Harbor. Overwhelming numerical superiority, more experienced pilots and aircraft carriers organized into a Kido Butai, or mobile strike force, that has already devastated Allied naval power from Hawaii to Ceylon. The Kido Butai's reputation by the spring of 1942 borders on the mythic among naval observers on both sides of the Pacific, a concentrated striking force whose combination of numbers, aircraft quality, and pilot skill had, in every engagement fought since December 1941, proven capable of overwhelming whatever Allied naval forces attempted to oppose it. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo commands this strike force, built around 4 fleet carriers: Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, and Soryu, each carrying veteran air groups whose pilots have flown in every major Japanese naval operation since the war began. Nagumo, a career officer more experienced in surface warfare than the still-developing discipline of carrier aviation, had led this same strike force through the Pearl Harbor attack and the subsequent rampage across the Indian Ocean, a background that has earned him considerable prestige within the Imperial Japanese Navy, even as some of his own subordinate officers privately question whether his tactical instincts fully match the demands of the increasingly complex carrier warfare his command now represents. Opposing this seemingly overwhelming force, the United States Navy can muster only 3 carriers of its own: USS Enterprise and USS Hornet, forming Task Force 16 under Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, and USS Yorktown, hastily patched together after suffering serious damage at the Battle of the Coral Sea weeks earlier, leading Task Force 17 under Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher. Yorktown's repair alone represents an extraordinary logistical achievement. Pearl Harbor naval shipyard workers laboring around the clock for barely 72 hours to patch damage that naval engineers had originally estimated would require weeks or even months to properly address. A rushed repair job undertaken specifically because Nimitz recognizes that every available carrier deck will be essential to any realistic chance of intercepting Yamamoto's approaching fleet. What gives the American forces their one crucial advantage is not visible on any deck or in any cockpit. Navy cryptanalysts under Commander Joseph Rochefort have broken enough of the Japanese naval code to determine Yamamoto's target and timetable in advance, handing Admiral Chester Nimitz the extraordinary gift of knowing precisely where and when the Japanese fleet intends to strike. Rochefort's team, working out of a windowless basement office at Pearl Harbor that its own personnel jokingly refer to as the dungeon, pieces together fragments of intercepted Japanese naval traffic through painstaking analysis, eventually confirming, through a deliberately planted false message, Midway's own garrison, radioing a fabricated report of a freshwater shortage, which Japanese intercepts subsequently reference using the exact code designation Rochefort's team had been trying to identify, that the mysterious target referenced repeatedly in Japanese communications is indeed Midway Atoll itself. This intelligence advantage allows Nimitz to position his outnumbered carriers in ambush rather than reacting blindly to a Japanese attack, but it does nothing to change the fundamental mismatch in aircraft quality and pilot experience that separates the two fleets converging on Midway. Nimitz, aware that his intelligence advantage represents an opportunity that could easily be squandered through overly cautious deployment, positions his 3 carriers northeast of Midway itself, close enough to strike Nagumo's approaching fleet, but concealed from Japanese reconnaissance. A calculated gamble that depends entirely on Rochefort's code-breaking remaining accurate, and on Japanese search patterns failing to detect the American ambush waiting for them. Among the American aircraft preparing for this decisive confrontation, the SBD Dauntless dive bomber occupies a particularly unglamorous position in the popular imagination of naval air power, overshadowed by the sleeker Wildcat fighters and the torpedo-carrying Devastators that most naval officers consider the true offensive punch of American carrier aviation. Naval doctrine throughout the interwar years and into the early stages of the Pacific War had generally treated the torpedo bomber as the primary ship-killing weapon of carrier aviation, dive bombers relegated to a secondary, supporting role in most tactical planning, an assumption about to be overturned as dramatically as any other piece of pre-war naval doctrine that June morning. What none of the men aboard Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, or Soryu yet understand, as their aircraft prepare for what they expect will be another routine day of Japanese naval dominance, is that this slow, unglamorous dive bomber is about to accomplish something no battleship, no torpedo plane, and no fighter aircraft has managed anywhere in the Pacific War to this point. Will Yamamoto's meticulously planned trap spring shut on the outnumbered American fleet exactly as designed, or is the Imperial Japanese Navy about to discover, in the span of a few catastrophic minutes, precisely how badly it has misjudged the aircraft it never bothered to fear? The morning of June 4, 1942, begins disastrously for the American carrier forces converging on Midway. Torpedo squadrons launched from all three American carriers locate the Japanese fleet first, and what follows becomes one of the most harrowing sacrifices of the entire Pacific War. Torpedo Squadron 8, flying obsolete Devastator torpedo bombers from USS Hornet under the command of Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, presses its attack against Nagumo's carriers without any fighter escort. The squadron's slow, lumbering aircraft, cut to pieces by Japanese Zero fighters and anti-aircraft fire before a single torpedo finds its mark. Waldron, who had reportedly told his squadron before takeoff that he intended to lead them into the Japanese fleet, regardless of what other American units accomplished that day, presses his attack with a determination that several survivors and observers later describe as bordering on suicidal certainty. His squadron flying directly into a wall of defensive fire from Japanese Zeros that had nothing else to intercept at that altitude, and nothing to distract them from methodically destroying, one by one, every slow-moving Devastator in Waldron's formation. Of the 15 aircraft and 30 men who take off with Waldron that morning, only a single pilot, Ensign George Gay, survives the attack, watching from a life raft as the battle he helped set in motion unfolds around him. Gay, badly wounded and forced to hide beneath a seat cushion in the water to avoid drawing the attention of circling Japanese aircraft, witnesses firsthand the destruction of Nagumo's carriers only hours later, an extraordinary vantage point on the very battle his own doomed squadron had helped make possible through the sacrifice of every other pilot who launched alongside him that morning. Torpedo Squadrons 6 and 3, launched from Enterprise and Yorktown respectively, suffer similarly catastrophic losses in the following minutes, pressing home attacks that inflict no damage on the Japanese carriers, but that accomplish something none of the doomed pilots could have anticipated, drawing Japanese combat air patrol fighters down to low altitude, where they burn through fuel and ammunition, annihilating the American torpedo planes, leaving the skies above Nagumo's carriers dangerously unguarded at high altitude. Lieutenant Commander Lance Massey, leading Yorktown's Torpedo Squadron 3, and Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay, leading Enterprise's Torpedo Squadron 6, both die alongside the vast majority of their own pilots in these attacks. Their sacrifice, entirely unplanned and uncoordinated between the separate American task forces, nonetheless converging into precisely the tactical circumstance that dive bomber squadrons arriving minutes later would exploit to devastating effect. Nagumo, meanwhile, faces a tactical dilemma of his own making that will prove catastrophic. Having launched an initial strike against Midway Atoll itself that morning, Nagumo receives a scout report indicating the presence of American ships, including what appears to be a carrier, forcing him into an agonizing decision about how to rearm his reserve aircraft. The scout plane responsible for this critical report launched later than originally scheduled due to a catapult malfunction aboard the cruiser Tone, delivers its contact report only after Nagumo has already committed to rearming his reserve strike force with ground attack ordnance intended for a second strike against Midway itself, a sequence of small delays and misjudgments that, individually minor, compound into a crisis of timing that Nagumo's staff struggles to resolve under mounting pressure. Japanese deck crews, in the middle of switching bomb loads from ground attack ordnance back to torpedoes suitable for a naval engagement, find themselves caught in a chaotic scramble as this new intelligence arrives. Live bombs and fuel hoses scattered across the hangar decks of all four carriers in a dangerous accumulation of exactly the kind of combustible material that no naval officer wants exposed on an active flight deck during combat operations. Sailors working these hangar decks, many of them exhausted after hours of continuous operations since before dawn, struggle to stow the removed ordnance safely amid the confusion. Some bombs left simply resting against bulkheads or stacked in passageways for lack of time to properly secure them in the ship's magazines, an accumulation of risk that none of the men laboring under these conditions fully appreciate until it is far too late to matter. This delay, compounding the confusion sown by the doomed American torpedo attacks, leaves Nagumo's carriers in precisely the wrong condition, at precisely the wrong moment. Decks cluttered with munitions, fighters low on fuel after repelling wave after wave of torpedo planes, and no meaningful defense prepared against an attack from directly overhead. That attack arrives almost by accident. Lieutenant Commander Wade McClusky, leading Enterprise's combined dive bomber groups, has spent nearly 2 hours searching for the Japanese fleet, after an initial contact report proves inaccurate, burning through fuel reserves that leave his aircraft dangerously close to the point of no return, forcing him to make an agonizing calculation about whether to continue the search or turn back toward Enterprise before his squadrons run dry over open ocean. McClusky, a fighter pilot by original training pressed into an unfamiliar command role leading dive bombers, faces a decision with no clear correct answer available to him in the moment. Aware that turning back preserves his aircraft and his pilots' lives, but abandons any chance of striking the Japanese fleet that day, while continuing the search risks losing aircraft to fuel exhaustion over hundreds of miles of empty Pacific Ocean, with no realistic prospect of rescue. McClusky's fateful decision to continue searching a few minutes longer, following his instinct and then spotting the wake of a lone Japanese destroyer, the Arashi, racing to rejoin the main fleet after depth-charging an American submarine, leads him directly to Nagumo's carriers at almost the exact moment Yorktown's dive bombers, under Lieutenant Commander Max Leslie, arrive from an entirely separate direction, an extraordinary, unplanned convergence that concentrates devastating American striking power against Japanese carriers whose fighter cover remains, thanks to the torpedo squadron's sacrifice, dangerously out of position at low altitude. Leslie's own squadron, flying from Yorktown, arrives at the Japanese fleet through an entirely independent navigational process, with no coordination whatsoever between his group and McClusky's, a coincidence of timing that later strikes American naval historians as one of the most remarkable pieces of fortune in the entire history of naval warfare. Two separate American dive bomber formations converging on the same enemy fleet within minutes of each other by pure chance, rather than any deliberate tactical planning. At 10:22 that morning, McClusky's dive bombers from Enterprise's Bombing 6 and Scouting 6 squadrons roll into their attack dives against Kaga and Akagi, while Leslie's Yorktown squadron simultaneously dives against Soryu from a different bearing entirely. The Japanese carriers suddenly finding themselves under coordinated assault from multiple directions at once, with almost no functional fighter defense positioned at altitude to intercept the attackers. 0 fighters that had spent the preceding half hour tearing through wave after wave of American torpedo planes at wave-top altitude now find themselves scrambling desperately to climb back to intercept the dive bombers, a climb that simply takes too long, the American aircraft already committed to their dives before more than a handful of Japanese fighters can reach an altitude and position from which to meaningfully interfere. The SBD Dauntless dive bombers plunge nearly vertically from roughly 14,000 feet, pilots holding their aircraft in punishing 70-degree dives that generate tremendous speed and accuracy, releasing 1,000-pound bombs at altitudes low enough to guarantee devastating hits against ships that, moments earlier, believed themselves reasonably secure from serious aerial threat. The physical toll of these dives on the pilots themselves is severe. The tremendous G-forces generated during both the dive and the subsequent pull-out pressing airmen deep into their seats and testing the structural limits of aircraft never originally designed, with this exact tactical application foremost in mind. Yet the Dauntless's dive brakes, extended flaps that dramatically increase drag and allow pilots to control their descent speed with a precision no other American carrier aircraft of the period could match, proved decisive in allowing these attacks to achieve the accuracy that will define the entire battle. Kaga absorbs multiple direct hits within seconds, bombs tearing through her flight deck and igniting the massed fuel and ordnance still scattered across her hangar decks from the interrupted rearming operation. Secondary explosions ripping through the ship with a violence that transforms what had been one of Japan's most powerful carriers into an inferno within minutes. Crewmen aboard Kaga describe a sequence of explosions so rapid and overwhelming that damage control parties, however well trained, find themselves fighting fires that spread faster than any firefighting effort could hope to contain. Entire sections of the ship transformed into raging infernos as burning aviation fuel spreads across decks, already littered with exposed bombs and ammunition from the chaotic rearming scramble only minutes earlier. Akagi, Nagumo's own flagship, suffers what should be a survivable number of direct hits, by some accounts as few as 2 or 3 bombs, but the timing proves catastrophic, striking precisely as her own deck crews are moving armed and fueled aircraft into position. The resulting explosions and fires spreading uncontrollably through spaces packed with exactly the volatile materials that had been sitting exposed during the chaotic rearming scramble. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the aerial attack on Pearl Harbor months earlier, and now watches Akagi's destruction from a sickbed aboard the burning carrier, later describes the scene in vivid terms in his own post-war accounts, witnessing firsthand how quickly a warship that had seemed, only minutes before, invulnerable and dominant, became a floating wreck consumed by fires no amount of Japanese naval discipline or training could extinguish. Soryu, struck simultaneously by Leslie's Yorktown squadron in the exact same span of minutes, suffers an identical fate, 3 bomb hits transforming her into a burning wreck with terrifying speed, her own magazines and fuel stores feeding fires that her crew has no realistic hope of controlling. Survivors from Soryu later recount the sheer speed of the ship's transformation from an active, functioning warship into an uncontrollable inferno. Some crewmen barely able to process what had happened before finding themselves forced to abandon their posts entirely, driven back by heat and smoke that made continued firefighting efforts not merely difficult, but physically impossible within mere minutes of the initial bomb hits. Within those 6 catastrophic minutes beginning at 10:22, 3 of Nagumo's 4 fleet carriers have been transformed from the most powerful naval striking force in the Pacific into burning, sinking wrecks, their aircraft, their veteran pilots still aboard preparing for launch, and the accumulated combat experience of 6 months of unbroken Japanese victory, all consumed in fires that no amount of damage control training could hope to extinguish. Kaga, Akagi, and Soryu burned simultaneously within sight of one another that morning, a scene of destruction so complete and so concentrated in time that surviving Japanese officers aboard nearby escort vessels struggle, even as they watch it unfold, to process the scale of what has just happened to a fleet that had, only minutes earlier, appeared invincible. Nagumo, watching his flagship burn beneath him, is forced to transfer his command to the light cruiser Nagara, abandoning Akagi as her crew fights a losing battle against flames feeding on aviation fuel and live ordnance scattered throughout her hull. Only Hiryu, positioned separately from the other 3 carriers at the moment of the American attack, escapes the devastation entirely, her aircraft still intact and ready to launch a counterattack that will, within hours, extract a measure of revenge against the American fleet that has just accomplished the impossible. Hiryu's surviving air group launches 2 waves of attacks against the American carriers that afternoon, the second of which locates and critically damages USS Yorktown, forcing her crew into a desperate but ultimately unsuccessful battle to save the ship, which sinks 2 days later after being struck by a Japanese submarine while under tow. Yorktown's crew, having already survived the extraordinary repair effort that patched her Coral Sea damage in barely 3 days, fights valiantly to save their ship a second time within the span of a single month. Damage control parties working through raging fires and flooding compartments in an effort that ultimately proves unable to overcome the cumulative damage from 2 separate Japanese attacks, striking a hull already weakened by its hastily completed earlier repairs. But American dive bombers, launched again from Enterprise late that same afternoon, locate Hiryu in turn, and by early evening on June 4th, all 4 of Nagumo's fleet carriers lie sunk or sinking, an annihilation of Japan's carrier striking power so complete and so swift that naval officers on both sides of the Pacific struggle, in the immediate aftermath, to fully comprehend what has actually happened in the span of a single day. Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, commanding the carrier division that included Hiryu, chooses to remain aboard his flagship as it sinks, rather than transfer to a rescue vessel, a decision reflecting the same code of honor and accountability that governs much of Japanese military culture throughout the war. Going down with his ship, alongside Hiryu's own captain, in a final act that Japanese naval accounts of the battle treat with particular solemnity, even amid the broader catastrophe unfolding around them. Yamaguchi's decision, communicated to his surviving officers before the final abandonment of the ship, reflects a widely shared conviction among Japan's senior naval leadership that responsibility for such a catastrophic defeat demanded personal accountability of the most absolute kind, a cultural dimension of the battle's aftermath that stands in stark contrast to how American commanders, having achieved the victory, would go on to process and publicly discuss the same engagement in the years that followed. The human and material cost of the Battle of Midway proves staggering for Japan, in ways that extend far beyond the 4 lost carriers themselves. Japan loses approximately 3,057 sailors and airmen killed, including the overwhelming majority of the highly trained carrier air crews, who had spearheaded every major Japanese naval victory since Pearl Harbor. Veteran pilots whose combat experience and technical skill Japan's training pipeline, already strained by the demands of a rapidly expanding war, proves fundamentally unable to replace at anything approaching the rate needed to sustain the kind of aggressive carrier operations that had defined Japan's first 6 months of war. Japan's pre-war pilot training program, deliberately structured around producing a relatively small number of extraordinarily skilled aviators through years of rigorous selection and instruction, simply cannot replicate that same depth of experience quickly enough to replace the losses suffered in a single afternoon. A structural weakness in Japanese naval aviation policy that Midway exposes with brutal, irreversible clarity. Where American training programs, drawing on a far larger population base and increasingly streamlined instructional methods, would go on to produce thousands of competent replacement pilots throughout the war's remaining years, Japan's elite, years-long pilot selection process meant that the veteran aircrews lost aboard Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu represented an irreplaceable institutional resource, their combined experience and skill essentially impossible to reconstitute at any pace fast enough to matter for the increasingly desperate battles still to come. American losses, while genuinely painful, remain dramatically smaller by comparison. 307 American sailors and airmen killed, along with the loss of Yorktown and the destroyer USS Hammond, sunk during the same submarine attack that finished off the crippled carrier. Hammond, positioned alongside Yorktown to provide power and pumping assistance during the salvage effort, is struck by the same spread of torpedoes fired by the Japanese submarine I-168, her own hull breaking apart and sinking within minutes. A final, tragic postscript to a battle that had otherwise unfolded as an overwhelming American strategic triumph. The strategic consequences of Midway ripple outward across the remainder of the Pacific War, with a force that historians have consistently identified as decisive. Japan's carrier force, the instrument that had projected Imperial Japanese naval power across the entire Pacific and Indian Ocean theaters since December 1941, never fully recovers from the losses suffered in this single battle, forcing Japan onto a strategic defensive posture from which it will never again seize the kind of sweeping offensive initiative that characterized the war's opening months. Historians studying the battle in the decades since have frequently described Midway as the moment the strategic initiative in the Pacific War changed hands permanently. A single day's fighting accomplishing what months of subsequent, grinding island campaigns would otherwise have been required to achieve. Had Japan's carrier fleet emerged from Midway intact and able to continue dictating the pace and location of major naval engagements across the Pacific. The United States, its own industrial base, only beginning to shift into full wartime production, gains the breathing room it desperately needs to build the overwhelming naval superiority that will eventually crush Japan's remaining forces across a string of increasingly costly island campaigns, stretching from Guadalcanal to Okinawa. American shipyards, freed from the immediate pressure of facing a Japanese fleet capable of overwhelming carrier strikes against the American homeland or Hawaii itself, accelerate an already ambitious wartime shipbuilding program that will, within 2 years, produce Essex-class fleet carriers at a pace Japan's shipbuilding industry could never hope to match, a growing material imbalance that Midway's outcome makes possible by buying American planners the critical time needed to translate industrial capacity into actual warships. Within months of Midway, American forces launched the Guadalcanal campaign, the first major Allied offensive of the Pacific War, an operation that would have been unthinkable had Japan's carrier fleet remained intact and capable of the kind of aggressive strikes that had characterized the war's opening phase. The Guadalcanal campaign, beginning in August 1942 with the landing of the 1st Marine Division and stretching into a brutal 6-month struggle for control of the island and its critical airfield, tests American naval and ground forces severely in its own right. Yet it represents exactly the kind of sustained offensive commitment that Nimitz and his planners could never have contemplated launching had they still faced the prospect of a fully intact Japanese carrier force capable of the same devastating strikes that had crippled Allied naval power throughout the war's opening months. For the SBD Dauntless specifically, Midway transforms the aircraft's reputation as thoroughly and as suddenly as the battle itself transformed the strategic balance of the entire Pacific War. An aircraft that entered the battle regarded, even within its own service, as a slow, unglamorous workhorse overshadowed by faster fighters and more dramatic torpedo bombers, emerges from June 4, 1942, as the single most decisive weapon system of the entire engagement, credited with sinking 4 Japanese fleet carriers within the span of a single day, a feat no other aircraft type in either Navy's arsenal came remotely close to matching. Naval planners and aviation officials who had previously debated whether to accelerate development of a Dauntless successor with greater speed and range now find themselves confronting a far more complicated question: how to weigh an aircraft's raw performance statistics against a demonstrated combat record that had just proven decisive in the most consequential naval battle of the entire Pacific War. Naval aviators who had once dismissed the Dauntless's modest performance specifications increasingly come to appreciate exactly the qualities that had allowed it to succeed where faster, more heavily escorted aircraft had failed. Its exceptional stability in a steep dive, its rugged construction, capable of absorbing the tremendous stresses of near-vertical bombing runs, and its dive brakes, which allowed pilots to maintain precise control and accuracy at speeds that would have torn less carefully engineered aircraft apart. Pilots who flew both the Dauntless and its intended successor, the SB-2C Helldiver, frequently expressed a preference for the older aircraft's handling characteristics, even after the newer type entered service. A testament to how thoroughly the Dauntless's performance at Midway and subsequent battles had cemented its reputation among the men who actually flew it into combat, regardless of what raw performance specifications on paper might have suggested about its supposed successor's superiority. The Dauntless continues flying combat missions throughout the remainder of the Pacific War, participating in nearly every major carrier engagement that follows Midway. Its reputation as the aircraft that turned the tide of the entire war, firmly established among the pilots, commanders, and historians who study the battle in the decades since. From the Solomon Islands campaign through the Battle of the Philippine Sea, Dauntless squadrons continue delivering the same precise, punishing dive-bombing attacks that had proven so devastating at Midway, even as newer aircraft types gradually assume a greater share of American carrier striking power in the war's final 2 years, the Dauntless never fully relinquishing the reputation for reliability and accuracy that its performance at Midway had so decisively established. By the war's end, Dauntless crews are credited with sinking more Japanese warship tonnage than any other Allied aircraft type of the entire conflict. A cumulative record built directly on the foundation laid in those 6 catastrophic minutes over Nagumo's carriers, when an aircraft nobody particularly feared proved itself the single most consequential weapon of the Pacific War's most decisive battle. This cumulative tonnage record, compiled across thousands of individual combat sorties, flown by Dauntless crews throughout the Pacific War, stands as a quiet but overwhelming statistical rebuttal to every early assessment on both the American and Japanese sides that had dismissed the aircraft as a secondary, unglamorous component of naval air power rather than the war-shaping weapon it ultimately proved to be. What the story of Midway ultimately reveals is how completely a single morning's convergence of intelligence, sacrifice, and unglamorous but devastatingly effective technology can overturn 6 months of seemingly unstoppable momentum. Japan's carrier pilots had every reason, based on their own experience and Japan's uninterrupted string of victories since Pearl Harbor, to underestimate an aircraft as modest in appearance and reputation as the SBD Dauntless. That confidence, forged through months of genuine battlefield success against opponents who had, until Midway, never seriously threatened Japan's carrier fleet, left Nagumo's command culturally and doctrinally unprepared for an enemy capable of exploiting the narrow, unforgiving window of vulnerability that a chaotic rearming operation and an unescorted torpedo sacrifice had briefly opened above his ships. That underestimation cost them everything within the span of 6 minutes, a reminder that the machines and men least feared on any battlefield are often precisely the ones capable of delivering the most devastating and unexpected blow, and that no advantage in experience, skill, or momentum can fully protect against the danger of contempt for an enemy whose true capabilities have simply never been properly tested. Every navy that has ever entered a decisive engagement convinced of its own inevitable superiority has, at some point, confronted the same lesson Nagumo's fleet learned in those 6 minutes off Midway, that the balance of any battle can shift entirely on factors invisible until the moment they matter most. A broken code, a sacrificed squadron, a lucky wake spotted on open water, and an unglamorous dive bomber whose pilots simply refused to miss.